Prince Louis, son of the mighty French king Philip II Augustus, had his eyes set on a crown, but not the one that his father still held. After all, that would be Louis's in due course when Philip eventually died in 1223. No, the crown that Louis had his eyes set on was the English crown. The King of England, John, was in dire straits. Philip had destroyed the Angevin Empire that John had held at the outset of his reign. John had wasted huge sums of money on campaigns in France in order to undo the damage, but had nothing to show for his efforts. To top it all, John had thrown his lot in with the Emperor Otto IV, who fought against Philip at the Battle of Bouvines in 1214. Though John himself wasn't present at the battle, he had sent a sizable English contingent to bolster the imperial ranks. The battle ended in a catastrophic defeat for John and his allies, and now made civil war in England inevitable between John and his barons, who were sick of seemingly endless disasters. In 1203, or perhaps 1204, King John had committed one of the most shocking acts of his reign. Allegedly, after becoming heavily drunk, John had murdered his teenage nephew Arthur, and supposedly tied a rock to Arthur's corpse and threw him in a river. This version of events is questionable, but it is almost certain that John did have Arthur killed. Arthur was the son of John's older brother Geoffrey, which technically put him higher up in the line of succession than John. But John's other brother, Richard the Lionheart, had somewhat inexplicably designated John to be his heir, rather than Arthur. Arthur had been a useful political pawn for Philip II during his early struggles with John, but the King of England eventually wrested back his nephew into his control. As it was, Philip could make do without Arthur. As horrifying as it was, the killing of Arthur had meant that John had removed an obvious danger to his rule, but another decade of turbulence caused John's nobility to look for other alternatives, and it was to Louis that they turned. Louis was married to Blanche of Castile, whose mother Eleanor was John's sister. Claiming the English crown by right of his marriage to a granddaughter of Henry II Plantagenet was fairly weak, but it wouldn't stop Louis, and for the exasperated English, it felt as though Louis could hardly do a worse job of ruling England than John had done up to this point. Famously, the barons had tried to keep the king's powers in check by thrusting upon him Magna Carta. John did put his seal on the Great Charter, but it was fairly obvious what was going through his mind as he did so. Almost immediately, John turned to his newfound ally, Innocent III, the Pope. John had done much to aggravate Pope Innocent in the past, but as his political situation grew increasingly pitiful and desperate, he felt as though he had no option other than to go grovelling before the Pope in order to gain a powerful supporter. John agreed to make England a papal fief, which meant that he would pay the Pope an annual tribute. In return, after the sealing of Magna Carta in 1215, Innocent III declared the charter to be null and void. This did nothing to ease the simmering hostility towards John, and only served to escalate the crisis. In this backdrop, having been invited to cross the Channel, it can be supposed that Louis's hopes of becoming King of England must have been high. On his arrival in England, Louis was declared the new king at the old St. Paul's Cathedral, which burned down in the Great Fire of London in 1666. There was no crown placed upon Louis's head, but homage was paid to him by many of the most powerful men in England and even the King of Scotland. Louis then set out to make his dream of becoming King of England a reality. Areas such as Winchester soon came under his control. But in late October 1216, the situation changed. John died of dysentery, a miserable and wretched death. Just days before, the sickly king had lost his crown jewels in the Wash estuary, an incident that was truly symbolic of John's reign. Some may have speculated at the time that this was a sign that John was about to lose more than just his crown jewels, but also his entire kingdom. However, he died before Louis, or any other claimant for that matter, could depose him. The throne now passed to John's 9-year-old and entirely innocent son, the new king, Henry III. For Louis, it didn't matter whether the new King of England was a young boy or not. He still wanted the crown for himself. But John's death had created two problems for his ambitions. Sympathy for Louis's cause dwindled somewhat after John's passing. Anger in the country had been directed purely at King John. There was no such ill feelings towards the boy king, Henry, who had no control over the situation. The other issue for Louis was that Henry was in the protection of the most brilliant knight in all of Europe at that time, William Marshal. Marshal, due to his age, had been reluctant to accept guardianship over the new king, but ultimately he would not abandon the boy or the crown that he had served so nobly since the time of Henry II. Still, Louis remained steadfast in his ambitions, and in 1217 he returned to France in order to bolster his depleted ranks. In his absence, castles that had been taken by Louis were razed to the ground by his enemies. On his return to England 7 weeks later, Louis travelled to Winchester, where he made repair works and left a strong garrison. Here he decided to divide his army into two. Louis himself led one half to besiege Dover, one of the most important castles in the country, whilst the other half of the French army marched towards the Midlands, where they relieved a siege of one of Louis's castles in Leicestershire, before they then marched on Lincoln, where they would be held up by the female sheriff Nicolas de la Haye. The French launched a brutal assault on Lincoln's walls, but were met by defiant resistance, organised by Nicola herself. As admirable as Nicola's efforts were, she would need outside help, and this was forthcoming in the shape of an army led by William Marshal. Marshal and his men relieved the siege before engaging the French in battle. The chronicler Roger of Wendover wrote, "Then the French battalions, seeing the fall of their commander, Thomas, Count of Perche, took to flight. Both horse and foot soldiers were lost in great numbers." News of their disastrous defeat soon filtered through to Louis. Although there were further skirmishes between Louis's forces and those loyal to Henry III, it was clear that any momentum in Louis's campaign had now effectively evaporated. The time had come for peace terms to be agreed. The role of King John, although he was now dead, was not forgotten, nor were his evil customs, and Magna Carta was reissued. For Louis's part, he was absolved for his war against Henry, who, due to the agreement made by Henry's father, was under papal protection. The French prince was then reunited with his supporters, who had been taken prisoner. And finally, Louis was granted a hugely generous financial settlement, an inflated sum designed to speed up Louis's departure from England. On September the 29th, 1217, Louis finally left England, never to return. He would one day rule over France as King Louis VIII, although only for a few short years. His war for England was now at an end.